Many philosophers around the centuries, including Spinoza and more recently Amartya Sen, have said that the purpose of public policy is to help people live the kinds of lives they have reason to value. In other words, it is nobody's business to tell people how to live their lives. Our job as government, as the state, policymakers, is how to ensure that people live the kinds of lives they have reason to value, and we call that broadly the concept of well-being. The fundamental concept we have, therefore, in terms of framing this, is to say that how we can help is to increase people's opportunities and capabilities to live the kinds of lives they have reason to value. So the focus of public policy is on increasing opportunities and capabilities without prejudging how people want to or need to live their lives. The good news is, from a public policy perspective, although we don't want to interfere with people's lives, a lot of work around the world, now summarized by the OECD, shows that what we call the domains of well-being are common across humanity. So whether you talk about people across time, across history, across cultures, across countries, there are about 11 domains of well-being that are common as platforms. And if we can provide those platforms to people, the rest is their business, it's not our business. So those domains are income and wealth. People do care about income and wealth. They do care about jobs and earnings. Housing is important, health, work and life balance, education and skills, social connections, civic engagement and governance, environmental quality, personal security, and overall subjective well-being. So, in essence, those are the platforms on which you can build public policy. If you can get public policy to focus and deliver on these, then I think we, as New Zealand, are in a very good place. As I said earlier, there are some common domains of well-being across humanity. The sources of that well-being are a bunch of things we call capital stocks. In other words, natural capital, the environment, biosecurity and biodiversity and so on. Human capital, which we conceptualize as health and education. Social capital, which is living together in an increasingly diverse society, trust among each other and with the government and other institutions. And economic capital, which is the bricks and mortars, the factories, the roads and all that kind of stuff. So that's really the engine. And if public policy can wrap around it these kinds of things, in other words, if we can somehow increase the resilience of those capital stocks to major systemic risks, for example, earthquakes, biosecurity, cybersecurity, and various other things, if we can make sure that we have the right institutions, that people in a diverse world, increasingly diverse world, live together in cohesion, if we can make sure that what we are talking about is sustainable so we don't exploit and overuse our resources and all that today at the expense of future generations, and if we can ensure that all this is shared equitably across society and across generations, then we're in a good place. So the exclusive focus of public policy then is how do you do this in a way that increases our potential economic growth as well as other things on a sustainable basis so intergenerational issues are taken into account. So that's the way we are thinking about public policy at large. In this context, poverty comes into play because it's a platform. In other words, we define poverty as exclusion. It's not only about income, it's about being able to access all these things that we are talking about in a way that allows people to live the kinds of lives they have reason to value. So increasingly the focus is on how do we identify exclusion, how do we actually frame public policy in a workable way to make sure that we do make a difference in people's lives. So as I said earlier, therefore, the focus today of public policy, and I'm very happy to be insulted on this, by the way, because all I'm saying is this is where we are, this is the direction of travel, very happy to be insulted and corrected, but that's the way we are thinking. So focus on capabilities and opportunities. And the triangle basically says that at the bottom of it, we are living in New Zealand, nowhere else. So the history, the culture, the values, the ethnic diversity of this place is the platform on everything we do. You cannot take ideas from all around the world and simply cut and paste it to New Zealand. So it is based on our culture, history, and values. That's absolutely essential. Think of water. If you were in America and other places, you may simply think, create a market for water, put a price on it, and everything will be right. But we have our culture, we have our Maori population, we have all these other things that come into play that we have to respect and bring into our solutions. That's just one example. If you're really talking about being able to contribute in a productive and meaningful way, then, as our young people just said, basic income, health, housing, education for everyone is a clear platform, because unless you have that, you cannot participate meaningfully and live the kinds of lives you have reason to value. And then we build an infrastructure on top of that. So in terms of description of poverty in New Zealand, in terms of where we are, we do recognize that it's not about income and financial and other things, but it's about all these other factors as well. So we are talking about income as well as basic needs and essentials. In our measurement of it, we do recognize that we have income poor, but not deprived, and we are talking about these other things that matter. Deprived but not income poor, so some people have income but they don't have access to other things. And then we measure what is the intersection point. So roughly speaking, about 5 to 6% of the population is deprived and income poor according to the latest statistics. And among children, that's close to 9 to 10%. There's a lot of debate as to whether that's increasing, decreasing, and all that, but that's really footnote in my judgment. This is very important. We need to focus and fix this. So the key issue is the policy packages we are talking about. So in the advice we provide to the incoming government, we said there is no single silver bullet, to use a New Zealand expression. You have to deal with policy packages. And those policy packages, first of all, recognize, on top of that, is we need to deal with poverty and exclusion. That's a platform. We need to deal with sustainability kind of issues. We need to make sure that the public sector is delivering what it's supposed to deliver. The major challenge for the public sector today is we have a bunch of silos who were built as silos about 100 years ago or more, and they are unable to function in a collective and collaborative way to deliver outcomes to citizens. That's the major issue. And of course, we need to take into account how do we get this engine of economic growth, which is about connecting ourselves better to the international world, making sure our young people are well trained and educated so that they get into jobs. And then we have the longer term issues about environment and so on. Once every 4 years, we have to look 40 years ahead and do a long-term statement. And to do that, we go right around the country to communities. We've been to 8 or 10 in the last 4 to 6 months, trying to extract what people in New Zealand are mainly concerned about. And what we're finding is environmental issues, poverty, inequality, and housing and jobs are the 5 themes that are emerging as big themes. And we will hold the mirror at the end of the year saying these are the big issues for New Zealand. How do we actually address and fix it? The buzzword is investment approach. In other words, how do we actually move this? So what we're talking about is investing in those capital stocks that I talked about, human capital, social capital, and so on. And I'll give you a flavor of one example to just give you a sense of how we are traveling in that regard and what the main challenges are. So everybody agrees, I think, that it would be a fantastic area of focus to focus on the most vulnerable children. We do now have very good data. We have an analytics and insight team in the central bureaucracy which is able to take that data and analyze it to death and basically make sure we understand which groups of children are most vulnerable, how do we influence them, and so on. Most importantly, we can identify the 4 to 6 indicators of trouble in the future. This is what we call by social investment. In other words, there is sufficient data to say, here are the children and their families around New Zealand. We know them by name and by address. We can actually zoom in on them and say, these are the people. And if there are 4 or 6 indicators, such as solo mother, who has not worked for 2 generations, lack of education, and so on and so forth. There are 4 to 6 indicators. We know that if a child has those symptoms, then there's trouble ahead. And so idea is if you invest in those kids and their families early, then even if you take a purely financial perspective, it's a winner. So that's what we call the investment approach. The challenge of the public sector is to apply it to right across the road. The ideal picture, which applies to all these capital stocks, is to say the fundamental focus of public policy is sustainable well-being. We should then decide what should we be investing in. And for example, right now, human capital within that mental health has been identified as a major area of focus. Suppose, pick that as an example only. Then you say what works. So you build these centers of what works. In other words, learning from around the world, from the local communities and all that, what are the kind of interjections that actually work to improve the mental health of the kid or their families. We have a database right around the country where communities feed into this database saying, this is what is working in my community. The fundamental thing is the solutions are in the community, not in Wellington. This is very important. Wellington can do the analysis, the number crunching and all that. When it comes to solution, it should work in those communities. And we have a hugely diverse range of communities. Whenever somebody says, this is what works, we run it through a test, and there are very rigorous ways of doing that. And then we go through implementation in local communities by bringing all these services together. So that's the model we're working towards. Are we anywhere near there? Absolutely not. But what we're saying is this is the direction of travel, and this is what needs to happen in order to progress this so-called investment approach, because the heart of the investment approach is in the right place, but implementation needs to go through these phases. And when it comes to implementation, it needs to be at the local level, with the central government simply saying, what can I do to help and support? So that's where we are going. We can talk about it later, but I think I used 15 minutes of my time. Thank you.